All right, this is looking at Eisenhower's New Look policy from 1951 until 1958. And so what we're going to, or 1952 until 1959, I think it is, until 1960 when JFK takes over. So we've got the big stick and good neighbor policy. What we're really looking at is Eisenhower's policy towards the hemisphere. And when we look at that, one of the things we need to consider is that although Latin America did have some actions, and under Eisenhower there was quite a few instances where the United States intervened, this is really considered a backwater and a less of a concern than other things that the hemisphere was dealing with, or that the world was dealing with. Eisenhower had a lot of issues within other parts. And so when we consider or look at this, we see that Latin America might be more of a minor concern for Eisenhower than Berlin and Eastern Europe and the revolution in Hungary and what was going on in Czechoslovakia and what was going on in the Suez Canal and Vietnam, that this seems to be just one of the areas that he was dealing with. Another thing we need to look at is the big stick to good neighbor policy, and just do a little review and go over what a good neighbor policy is in order to then say, well, then Truman began to change that and Eisenhower continued that change. So what we have here is the good old-fashioned, basically the gunboat diplomacy, where Roosevelt created the Roosevelt Corollary, which basically stated that we will intervene in the internal issues of a country in order to keep Europe out. And this is the Republic of Santo Domingo, or Dominican Republic, where Roosevelt...
You have a voluntary meeting in the library at this time.
Roosevelt began to deal with Roosevelt began to deal with the issues of Santo Domingo by taking over the custom houses. Okay. And to good neighbor. This is FDR trying to create better relations with Latin America. He actually goes on a tour. And most of that was because of the Great Depression and then into World War II needing allies. But even then, there was a definite change in U.S. foreign policy. So big stick and moral diplomacy. There was 20-some interventions in other countries, sending Marines, taking over custom houses, giving large loans, pushing democracy and then supervising elections. There was just a lot of interventions where the United States kind of put itself and its military into Latin America to force the issue and to support its big business and to support its pushing of democracy in the hemisphere. And then with Panama, taking Panama, making the canal, there's a lot of issues within Latin America where the United States created a lot of resentment and was very interventionist. In 1930, there's a Clark Memorandum, and it was actually when President Hoover was in office. And President Hoover realized or began to see that there was a lot of backlash from Latin America. Latin America did not like the United States, had a lot of hatred towards the United States, and so he wanted to deal with this. And so basically, he had Clark, who was an Undersecretary of State, write a memorandum on the Monroe Doctrine and how they should behave. And Clark basically came around and said that the Roosevelt Corollary and putting troops in countries and this type of thing is not what the Monroe Doctrine said. The Monroe Doctrine said both Europe and the United States will be hands-off Latin America. And so if we are going to stay with the Monroe Doctrine, we need to change our approach. That then is taken further by Roosevelt. In 1932, Hoover removes troops, then Roosevelt continues that, and all the troops are removed by 1934 from the hemisphere, from countries in the hemisphere. There was over 4 different countries where U.S. troops were. 1933, Roosevelt goes further than the Clark Memorandum and basically announces a U.S. policy, new policy in Latin America. No nation has the right to intervene in the internal and external affairs of another nation, and the United States commits to this. The United States commits to a non-intervention policy. In 1934, they repeal the Platt Amendment. And that's a complicated situation. They kind of use it in order to kind of manipulate the government in Cuba. We'll talk about that later. But either way, they repealed the Platt Amendment, basically saying that we are no longer going to intervene in Cuba. 1936 to 1944, there are examples where they renegotiate the Panama Canal to give Panama better rights and more of inclusion within the money-making capacity of the canal. Bolivia, which was nationalized its oil revenues, basically nationalizing. In Bolivia's case, they offered money but they expropriated it. They paid the tax value and took the oil from Standard Oil. Now, the United States decided not to do anything. Well, then Mexico did it, and Mexico actually has a lot of oil. And so they had to negotiate, but they did not use troops. Mexico had to pay more than what was on the tax revenues to Standard Oil, but the United States decided not to intervene and forced Standard Oil to negotiate and to deal with the fact that Mexico wanted its raw materials back. And so that leaves us here where we go from good neighbor now to Truman, who did not do much intervention, but definitely started some trends that we're going to continue here with Eisenhower. Real quick though, Canada is actually part of the hemisphere, so this can be used. In order to establish a defense for a new range Soviet bomber, the U.S. created NORAD with Canada. The Soviets eventually in 1957 came up with a new long-range bomber, so now mass retaliation didn't work anymore. And the U.S. created NORAD with Canada because they assumed that they would be attacked over the Canada mainland. And during Eisenhower's presidency, Canada grew closer to the United States in diplomatic and military terms, but Canada still has the little brother syndrome in that they fear U.S. domination. They fear that the U.S. will dominate their culture, their government, their choices. And so it took 4 years to negotiate this mutual defense agreement, as Canada had cold feet and did not want to get too close to the United States. And although Canada is very close during the Eisenhower presidency, they begin to diverge from the United States as the Cold War continues. So now we're going to move into Eisenhower's policy, which is a definite departure from good neighbor. So Dulles, black and white thinking. He was pro-business. He believed, and that's John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, that countries that were in the U.S. and those that were with the U.S. and those that were not. And if you were not with the U.S., you were against the United States. And he saw this, and he was also pro-business. So if you were anti-U.S. business or hurt business interests, you often were considered a communist. And in that case, Dulles looked at U.S. business and U.S. business being able to operate in the hemisphere as crucial moving forward. Eisenhower continues Truman's containment policy, and his main strategy to deal with containment in the hemisphere was to give military aid. So the Mutual Security Act, which was put in by Truman, was extended under Eisenhower to be MAP, or Military Assistance Program. It became a part of the hemispheric, or part of the U.S. government. And over $500,000 by 1954, or $500 million by 1954, was used within the Caribbean alone in military aid and military training. In 1957, Eisenhower opened the Office of Public Safety, or OPS, in 1957, which trained security forces of U.S. allies around the world, basically for anti-communism, that the police forces, the better trained they were, the more that they could put down rebellions. One of the results of this, and I think you could blame some of this on Truman, but a lot of this on Eisenhower as well, that 13 of the 20 countries were ruled by military dictatorships by 1954, which were pro-U.S. These dictators are strong men, could be very brutal, were very unpopular within Latin America and unpopular within their countries most of the time. And so over 13 of the 20 countries that the United States gave assistance to had military dictatorships because of this strategy of choosing to train the military and give military aid. Dulles refused to have the United States Department to intercede despite a lot of protests, because the dictator Perez Jimenez had political prisoners and had thousands of political prisoners in prison, was hoping to remove those people. Eisenhower awarded the Legion of Merit to Manuel Ordea of Peru, and Jimenez as well of Venezuela. And both of these men were removed later in Eisenhower's term, but in both these cases, you have a situation where these guys were given the Legion of Merit for anti-communism, but they were not very positive leaders for their countries and were very unpopular. Courage of the people. Bolivia. Now, Bolivia is a very different story here. So, Bolivia is a poor country. Not much wealth and resources. No seaport. They lost that in wars with in other Latin American countries. And basically their major resource was tin. And basically 3 families owned all the tin mines. They lived mostly in Europe. And so most of the wealth was going out of the country. So Bolivia, under the MNR, which was a socialist political party, they won elections in 1951. Truman didn't oversee them. They then wound up rebelling and taking power by 1952. They nationalized. They nationalized all the major industries, including tin mines. They nationalized anything that wasn't already taken in order to control. Then they begin land reform, where they take poor farmers' land and begin to give it to people so that they can begin farming. Now, Truman didn't recognize them, which led to them taking power in 1952. But Eisenhower and Dulles take a very different approach here. And instead of getting the CIA to overthrow, they took a moderate approach, as they gave loans, grants, and technical assistance of millions of dollars to Bolivia, including training the military, which in 1964 they lose. 1964, the military takes over and undoes a lot of what the MNR wanted to do. One of the things that might have caused them to take this more moderate approach was that there wasn't U.S. private investment in the country. And the MNR, although had some socialist ideals of land reform and nationalization, they made it clear that they weren't communists and that they were anti-communists. And so by doing this, the United States did not necessarily overthrow them. They were able to stay in power and do positive things for the Bolivia. But again, a lot of that was undone when the police or the military took over because of the way they'd been equipped by the United States. All right, that brings us to British Guiana, and a guy by the name of Chetty Jagan. Now, Chetty Jagan was an outspoken Marxist and was part of the British Guiana political party, or Communist Party. But what's interesting is he takes power, wins an election, and the CIA had already spent millions in an anti-propaganda campaign against Chetty Jagan within the country. They were giving it to labor unions, trying to U.S. labor unions that were working with labor unions in British Guiana, trying to get rid of them. What's interesting, though, is this is a colony of the British. And the British have their CIA, or their intelligence forces, and their intelligence basically on Chetty Jagan said that he is a communist, but he is not trying to overthrow the government. He is not working with the Soviets. He is willing to work within a democracy. He's willing to work within this, as they were running their own colony. Even though they were still a colony of the British, they were running it. Now, there were 2 U.S. companies, that Connecticut Copper and Reynolds Metals, that were really worried about nationalization because they had large holdings in the country. Well, instead of dealing with it like they did with Bolivia, basically, although Great Britain didn't feel like Shagan was a threat or a communist threat, Eisenhower put political pressure on Britain to nullify the election and to take him out of power, and that's what Great Britain did. They put troops into the country and removed Chetty Jagan from power. So we have two different kind of polar opposite issues within the hemisphere there, and obviously Bolivia was different than both Guatemala and British Guiana. All right, Nixon. As you can see here, Nixon's limousine is being attacked. And you might ask why. Well, his first visit in 1955, Nixon was impressed by two unpleasant and unpopular dictators in Cuba, by a guy by the name of Batista, and Nicaragua's Anastasio Somoza, who was a unsavory dude, killed thousands of Nicaraguans, both of whom were in Nixon's words, deal effectively with commies. The preoccupation with the communists pushed the U.S. into unsavory relationships, not just in Guatemala, not just in Cuba, not just in Nicaragua, but in Peru and Venezuela and other larger South American countries. Nixon, like all Republicans, wanted stability, anti-communism, and a favorable climate for U.S. businesses. However, he seemed to have his eyes more open in realizing that there were some problems within Latin America. With public speeches and in the State Department and with the Export-Import Bank for more help for Latin America. He was mainly ineffective, but he believed that Latin America deserved this help and that by giving this help, the U.S. would be helping themselves. Nixon's second visit was what we see here on the screen. In 1958, his visits made headlines. Many Latin American countries were highly dependent on U.S. producers, and when the U.S. went through a recession in 1957 to 58, it hit Latin American countries hard. And you begin to see this kind of mass protest where they're attacking, trying to overturn the limousine, and attacking Nixon. The aim of Nixon's visit actually was to go and before he went, Senate Foreign Relations Committee were worried by reports that Latin American diplomats were deeply disappointed by U.S. attitude toward their continent and that the United States was very unpopular in Latin America. They requested testimony by the State Department that reported relations were never better. As you can see, the State Department was had their head in the clouds a little bit and not looking at the reality. Before going into Argentina, to witness the inauguration of Arturo Frondizi, who he actually wound up being late to that inauguration. He went to Venezuela or Paraguay, where he met with General Alfredo Stroessner, who was a very unpopular kind of strongman, one of the most brutal of all the dictators. The visits to Peru and Venezuela were marked by violence, protests against Nixon. When Nixon attempted to go to one of the famous universities there, he was barred by 2,000 students who threw spit tobacco on him, threw fruit and bottles and rocks. And Nixon basically tried to walk through this mob. He had to turn around and retreat to a more conservative university where it was a little bit more friendly. But in Caracas, Venezuela is when really it became a big deal or a big problem by 4,000 strong mob trying to overturn Nixon's limousine, shouting death to Nixon. When Eisenhower heard about this, he sent the fleet down there with an aircraft carrier to hopefully airlift Nixon out. But Nixon told him not to do this. As soon as he heard about it, he said to not do this because all we're going to get is more negative backlash. And people felt like Eisenhower was using gunboat diplomacy again. In both of these countries, they had ousted brutal dictators, and that is why so many people were angry with the United States, not just for the economic conditions, but also because they supported these dictators that took away their rights, took away their freedoms, and forced them into these, and the U.S. forced on them these corrupt dictators, and were seen basically as part of U.S. foreign policy. Nixon afterwards said it was not enough to curry favor with leaders of Latin America, but we need to work with the people. And you can see in these pictures that, yes, the people were the ones that were really upset. All right, before we go to Bay of Pigs, I want to talk a little bit about Juscelino Kubitschek and his Operation Pan America. Was for the U.S. to give low-interest loans to Latin American countries to diversify their economies and build infrastructure. Brazil was asking for $3 million. One of the things that is interesting here is that, that Brazil wanted what other Latin American countries want, what Fidel Castro in the active Bogota, or part of the active Bogota era where he was asking for $30 billion to fund economic development in the hemisphere. We look at all the money that was spent on overturning governments, on supporting these corrupt governments. Would it have been better to spend a little bit more and create some economic or establish some economic development? At the same time, as Eisenhower didn't want to do this, he did, however, establish the Inter-American Development Bank in 1959 and gave them $1 billion to give out low-interest loans to Latin American countries. All right, what you see here is the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, the Bay of Pigs invasion happened on Kennedy's watch. It might have failed because of Kennedy, but what we have to see is that basically Castro came to power in Cuba. He immediately did not go to the United States for help. He didn't want the United States' help. He wanted to show Cuba that he was going to stand on his own. He did visit the United States in 1959. He was asking for, but he did not ask for U.S. aid, wanted to show Cubans that he would be the first Cuban leader since Jose Marti to not be subservient to the United States. The U.S. had dominated the economy of Cuba. They produced 40% of Cuba's sugar, controlled 36 of its 161 sugar mills, operated 2 of Cuba's 3 oil refineries, and 90% of its public utilities and 50% of its tourism industry. The United States was in control of Cuban economy. So he understood that Cubans wanted their national dignity restored. Without aid, Cuba could not afford to compensate North American planters whose property in Cuba was expropriated. So they wound up nationalizing without paying these businesses, and that turned Eisenhower administration and Dulles against him because they are pro-business. And immediately, instead of maybe working out a deal with Castro, instead of working out a deal with these companies, the United States cuts Castro off, cuts Cuba off, and Eisenhower orders the CIA to look into overthrowing Castro. Despite what the National Security Council and the CIA basically come up with later, is that we should follow more non-interventionist policy. But Eisenhower refused that. He wanted to get rid of Castro. But that was much more difficult than said. Castro had spies everywhere. He was more informed on what the CIA was doing than Eisenhower himself. He was clear on what was going to happen, and the Bay of Pigs invasion was doomed from the start. Also, Castro was not as unpopular as some of the others, nor was he willing to give up power as quickly as Arbenz did. So the Bay of Pigs invasion winds up being a disaster, and it sets the Kennedy administration back and makes them look weak to the Soviets, and probably set up what we call the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that is Eisenhower's New Look policy. It took a little bit longer than I wanted to, but hopefully this will be helpful to you, and then we'll have activities to do following to really break down this policy as we finish up looking at Eisenhower's New Look policy and its effect on the region.